Podcast odamıza hoş geldiniz. Gerçeklerin odak noktası, cesur fikirlerin ve özgür seslerin buluşma yeri Ahval'desiniz. Bizi internet ve sosyal medyadan da izleyebilirsiniz. Ayrıca mobil telefon uygulamalarımızı yüklemeyi de unutmayın. Haydi başlıyoruz.
Hello, our listeners. Today we have a very sharp Kurdish Affairs observer, Abdulla Hawez, with us to talk about the most recent developments of northeastern Syria and, of course, the Manbij, a northern city, which is a flashpoint between U.S. and Turkey and Russia and Syria, and, of course, the Kurds. Hawez is based in UK, and his Twitter feed, Abdulla Hawez, at Abdulla Hawez, is a very good source to follow the developments of Kurdish affairs at all time. Welcome to the Ahval podcast, Abdullah.
Thank you.
So, my first question on Manbij. Today, Turkish foreign minister, defense minister, and intel chief were in Moscow, and they had meetings with Russian counterparts. What is your reading of the latest on Manbij? What is going to happen, do you think, going forward?
Obviously, it's not so easy to predict, but I think it would be one of the two following scenarios. Obviously, Donald Trump has decided for U.S. troops to be pulled out of Syria, which means the scenario of Americans or Westerners staying there is out of question. They are not going to be there. So now we have two main players who may potentially replace Americans, who are either Assad and Russians with Iranians, or Turks with their opposition backers or opposition supporters. I think what we are seeing right now is that Manbij is going to be potentially controlled by Assad and their allies. And we have seen and we have heard today that Russians have confirmed that even after the Turks visited Moscow. So it seems Manbij may be controlled by Assad, but I think you cannot look at Manbij as an isolated area. It's part of the wider deal in Syria. I think if even if Assad goes to Manbij, it would be part of a whole package between Russians and Turks. Maybe Turks will get elsewhere in northeast Syria instead.
That was my second question, actually. Northeastern of Syria, as we all know, there are many Kurdish dominated towns, as well as some Arab dominated towns. Maybe the deal still being worked out between the Russian and Turks via Kurds and Damascus. So I do understand it's very hard to predict anything, including Manbij, as you just stated now. But let's say Turkey will be able to do some limited incursion in Tel Abyad, and then later maybe expand it. How do you think the Kurds would be reacting to any kind of Turkish incursion?
Obviously, the Kurdish stance, or let's say the Kurdish stance represented by YPG or PYD, is that they are opposing any Turkish incursion in Syria by like even 1 inch. So I think their stance is very clear. What's not clear to me is that Anakese or Kurdish Syrian Council, which is backed by Barzani, we don't really know what's their stance until now. It's a bit unclear to me, because they're also, obviously, they don't represent the majority of Syrian Kurds, and they don't have a lot of representation in Rojava, but they do still have some supporters. We like, when we talk about Syrian Kurds, I think we can not only talk about, let's say, YPG or PYD. We also have these other factions which is, I mean, their base is much more limited, but they are still, they still represent a portion of Kurds. So I think the stance of YPG and PYD is very obvious. They would obviously rather ally with Assad, Russia, Iran than with Turkey, because we have seen in Afrin, Turkey and their allies, FSA allies, they have basically cleared the city from most of the Kurds. According to Syrian Observatory NGO, more than 300,000 Kurds have been displaced in Afrin, which, by the way, Afrin is not a very big region. Probably the population was over 500,000. So we could say 70% of the Kurdish population have been displaced. So it's not a very good record. Obviously, I think most of the Kurds wouldn't support any Turkish incursion in elsewhere in Syria, because I mean, you have a very good example, which is Afrin, and we see what Turkey is doing to Kurds there. So yeah, I think most of the Kurds would be against any Turkish incursion in anywhere in northeast Syria.
So going forward, in one way or another, Turkey is going to impose itself to northeastern Syria. This is how it appears, whether with hard Turkish power, or whether that's what you just elaborated through other proxies, such as, I think, Kurdish National Council, which is close to KRG, as well as Ankara. Let's go with the scenario you just talk about it. Do you think it's a viable scenario for Turkey and KRG to support the KNC and to take over the Kurdish towns from PYD? Would the PYD and YPG let that scenario to be realized?
So as you said, I think given that US is going to withdraw, so for me, it's obvious that Turkey is going to, enter northeast Syria in some way. I don't know how it would be, because it depends on their deal with Russians, but they are going to go. Like, to be honest, this is very obvious to me. It's going to happen at least in some towns in northeast Syria, like Tel Abyad, Grespi in Kurdish, or elsewhere in northeast Syria, where there are a majority of Arab population. In the other areas, which is majority Kurdish population, yeah, there is this scenario that Anakasi or KNC, which is backed by KRG, especially Barzanis, it's a possible scenario. For me, I'm not going to dismiss this scenario, especially if Turkey, if it's obvious for Turkey that there would be a big backlash if they enter the Kurdish areas. They may use these proxies to make it easier, because there is a possibility if Turkey themselves, Turkish army, goes to the Kurdish towns in northeast Syria, we may see a scenario like what happened to Iraqi Kurds in 1991, where there was a mass fleeing of Kurds, which led to the no-fly zone, actually, by the Western powers. So I think when it comes to these calculations, Turkey is much more obviously nuanced than Saddam regime. So they may try to use the Kurdish proxies, because, by the way, there are even Kurds within FSA, which are mostly Islamist Kurds. They may use a variety of Kurdish factions in their if they go ahead with their incursion of Kurdish towns in Syria.
I understand. So we might, you also agree with some of the experts have been talking about that could be a mass Kurdish exodus to probably to KRG regions. Is this what we should be expecting them to move if Turkey, with its proxies, hard power, or the FSA, or with his own army, wanted to take over some of the Kurdish cities?
Yeah, I think this is a probable scenario, obviously, because the problem is you have the example of Afrin. before Afrin, you didn't have any examples, so it was a bit more difficult to predict. But now you have the example of Afrin. You know what's happening to the Kurds. So I think a lot of Kurds would try to wouldn't want to stay there. Would rather, I mean, go to KRG. At least in KRG, there are still Kurds. I mean, they can get some respect and some protect their dignities there. But we should also consider one other thing, which is I think a lot of people don't consider this dynamic. Unlike Afrin, Jazeera Canton, or especially Kamishli, is a bit socially a bit different. They are more conservative than Afrin. Afrin was actually much more secular compared to Kamishli, and Kamishli is even more tribal, and there is more support for Anakase or KNC and Barzanis in Kamishli. In Afrin, it was almost all the people were supporting, or majority of the Kurds were supporting YPG or PYD, and they were much more secular. But in Kamishli, which is the biggest Kurdish canton, and there is the biggest Kurdish concentration in Syria, I think the social dynamic is a bit different. So it depends on how Turkey would go about attacking these areas. If they use, let's say, KNC Peshmerga, Rojava Peshmerga, and other Kurdish factions, it may be a bit less severe than mass displacement of the Kurds. But if Turkish army itself goes, I think it's going to be a very nasty scenes, and a lot of people would flee because, I mean, to be honest, in general, even pro-Barzani Kurds, they don't trust Turkey. I mean, Turkish army if they go there. So most of the people would be afraid not only of themselves but of their families. So for them, probably the best scenario would be fleeing to KRG.
I understand. My next question, I have two more questions. This is the one before my final question. So it appears one of the, again, scenarios going forward as the Russians appear to be supporting the Assad forces are going to take over the places that the U.S. forces are withdrawing in coming months. How do you envision regions under the Assad control? Obviously, the Assad forces are still recovering. They went through a big civil war. What would be the, in 2022 northeastern Syrian regions if Assad has taken over those regions?
So here's what I think. If you ask me what would happen in the future until 2020, here's what I think will happen. We'll have Assad controlling some of the Arab populated areas like Manbij, probably to the east of Euphrates you have Raqqa, and then you have Turkey who would control some other portions, especially near the border. And then I think there's a probability that PYD may still control some areas in cooperation with Assad and Russians, some Kurdish pockets, small Kurdish pockets. And then there's one other thing. We still don't know if Russia is because Russians are saying something on TV and then something else is happening behind the curtains under the tables. So we don't know what the true intentions or true move of Russians are until they meet with Turks, because we saw what happened in Afrin on TV, on Russia Today, and on their media outlets. They were claiming they are backing Assad going to Afrin, and they are against Turkey going there because this is going to be violation of Syrian sovereignty. But then we saw they actually backed Turkey invading Afrin. So when it comes to Russians claiming stuff, putting statements, I don't, to be honest, believe them until we see what will happen in action, because this is what matters, not what they say. So, but to conclude it, I think Assad would go to some of the areas. I'm certain about that, because the SDF controlled areas are too big for Turkey to control all of it. It's a very problematic. I don't think even Erdogan won that. So it's going to be Assad controlling some of the areas, Turkey controlling some other areas, especially because Turkey wants to send back some of the refugees, and then maybe Kurds would still control some very small portions that are highly Kurdish concentrated, with the cooperation of Assad and Russians. So this is what I envision for Syria in the couple coming years.
Thank you. And my final question, looking back, 2016 August, Turkey did the first big intervention in Syria, Euphrates shield operation. Do you think that the Kurds, when you look at you look back, could they follow different strategy not to provoke Turks, perhaps instead of trying to link to Manbij, to Afrin, just stay, if they stayed in the northeastern part of Euphrates? Do you think we could have had a different Syria, and do you think the Syrian Kurds could have had better luck of holding their territories and in a more safe conditions?
Yes. I think to be frank, YPG or SDF, they have made a lot of mistakes. As you stated, for example, they provoked Turkey by, let's say, linking Manbij with Afrin, or linking all their cantons, which was a very big provocation for Turkey, because basically Turkish link with Arabs in Syria, they cut it totally, which is something, it's about the national security for Turkey. This is one. Also, YPG, they have done some other stuff which was wrong. For example, having all these pictures of Ocalan in Rojava. I mean, this is redundant. Why would you need that? I mean, if you want to rule this area, you should be a bit more smart. Plus, if you have seen in, let's say, Raqqa, when they liberated Raqqa is a majority Arab town. When they liberated it, they had this huge portrait of Ocalan behind them. I mean, to be honest, I don't understand it. I don't understand what was the logic behind this. And also, the way they ruled was very authoritarian, I would say. I mean, they didn't let other Kurds, let's say KNC and others, to operate in this area, which was also wrong. I mean, they had a lot of mistakes, but that does not mean they didn't have a lot of good stuff as well. I mean, if we look at it, they had good stuff and bad stuff, but I think they had more good stuff than bad stuff. But I think Americans should have played a role in politically, not only militarily, to make SDF to become more open, to let others operate in this area, to become more democratic, to open up, to try to open a channel between Turkey and SDF. But Americans didn't do any of that. They didn't basically do anything to help to make things better. I mean, obviously YPG had mistakes, but Americans had bigger mistakes, I think. I mean, if you are there, you have a lot of leverage over Turkey and over Kurds. Why didn't try to fix the problem? If they tried it, now we didn't need American troops there anymore. We didn't need it automatically by default, by the way, not because of some random decision by Trump. But they didn't do any of these. I think they're repeating the mistake of Iraq. They just pull out without any political preparation. So this is the problem with Americans in general. They just go somewhere. They think it's only hard, military solutions that can, fix the issues in these areas. But this is not true. We have seen in Iraq, we are seeing the same in Turkey, in northeast Syria, sorry. So I think PYD, which obviously has a link with PKK, they had mistakes, but they also had a lot of good stuff. For example, they were very, very effective when it comes to combating ISIS, which was the primary reason why Americans, partnered with them. So when it comes to this, they were very good. So if they are good, why don't you try to extend this military success to a political success. They didn't do any of these. So this is why we are seeing this mess now in Syria.
Thank you so much, Abdullah.
Thank you.
I agree that I think the Americans just focused on combating ISIS, which was a very important task, but they didn't really do much to on the areas that you have been elaborating, whether they're governing style or some of the tactics they followed, especially with regards to provoking Turkey. They could have been much more smarter. I agree with you. Thank you so much for coming on, and I am hoping to be able to keep talking to you in coming weeks and months.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Bye.